In this episode, we examine explosive protests from our recent past and how they shook the world.
With the kind of fervor that there is now, I think we're at an unstoppable place. I've never seen in my adult life the kind of activism that I see now.
In Bristol, historian David Olusoga explores the impact of history on this growing movement.
This is the convulsions that we're living through brought to bear on this statue.
Whilst in New York, descendant Kenneth B. Morris Jr. explores the pivotal role his ancestor Frederick Douglass played in the global fight for abolition.
Frederick Douglass would expect that his descendants continue that fight, to continue that struggle.
And Mayor of Bristol, Marvin Rees, tells a story of how direct action in the UK changed the course of our history.
It wasn't just about jobs on the buses. That led to the Race Relations Equalities Act in the UK.
Last year, disbelief, anger, as well as the possibility of change were in the air. In the wake of the murder of George Floyd in the United States, people took to the streets.
The killing of George Floyd and other African Americans at the hands of police has protesters taking to the streets in cities from coast to coast.
Voicing their indignation that yet another Black American had been killed by a white police officer, it sparked a passionate protest movement across the globe.
Black Lives Matter didn't just happen in the States, it happened in the UK, it happened in Europe, Africa, all over the world.
It's no longer just black people shouting Black Lives Matter. Everyone's saying it.
George Floyd's murder brought American police brutality and institutional racism into sharp focus. For many, even for those living thousands of miles away, the violence and injustice were deeply shocking.
Putting your knee on the neck of someone for 8 minutes and 45 seconds has nothing to do with policing. It's much, much more than that.
When I say Black Lives Matter, I'm asking you to accept it. Because for so long they haven't mattered, and they didn't matter. They could be sold, beaten, tortured, burned. You could do anything to them. So Black lives didn't matter.
Historian David Olusoga is more aware than most of the wealth which poured into Bristol from the slave trade. His work uncovering British history has taken him all over the world, but it's the city of Bristol that he today calls home.
I've lived in Bristol for about 20 years, and in that time, the city's been slowly, year by year, getting better, getting more willing to discuss its role in the Atlantic slave trade.
There's been a settlement inland from the Bristol Channel for over 1,000 years. But it wasn't until the 18th century when Bristol merchants could take full advantage of established trade networks that Bristol really started to boom.
Like hundreds of cities across Europe, it's got this history, this connections to slavery and the slave trade that have been unprocessed, that people have not wanted to acknowledge for decades.
2 weeks after the murder of George Floyd in the United States, Bristol also hit the headlines.
Protesters in Bristol have pulled down a statue of a slave trader during a day of otherwise largely peaceful Black Lives Matter demonstrations.
The pace of change, the pace at which these histories are just emerging into the present has suddenly accelerated. That one statue, that one story suddenly made Bristol the centre, the world centre of these debates about slavery, why it's been partly forgotten and why we need to remember it.
The statue of 17th century slave trader Edward Colston had been a source of controversy for many years. Born in Bristol in 1636, Edward Colston amassed a small fortune from the slave trade. In recent years, some in the city had called for an additional plaque to be added or for the statue to be removed entirely.
I can understand why somebody would want to take a statue down, but if we don't teach those statues, if we don't put them in museums, people are going to believe they never existed.
For me, I want those statues to remain, and I want the real truth put underneath. It should be lest we forget.
After the statue was recovered, it was put into storage until its future could be determined. But what should happen now to this most divisive statue? A potent symbol of slavery. After the statue of Edward Colston was pulled down in the summer of 2020, it was hidden away from view. After nearly a year of debate and controversy, historian David Olusoga has come to see the statue put on temporary display for the very first time. But it would no longer be standing tall.
Whenever you see a statue that's been taken off its pedestal, it looks diminished, looks less powerful, because a lot of the power comes from them being high up and looking down on you. 125 years it stood in the center of a city that just brushed under the carpet its involvement in the Atlantic slave trade. And then he is dumped into the harbor from which 2,000 slave trading expeditions set sail. You can see the scrapes and the scars from his journey across the streets of Bristol. This graffiti, it's just loaded with symbolism. I mean, the red on his hands is obviously a metaphor for the blood on his hands. And the scars are about the kind of battles that we're fighting and we're facing now. Edward Colston is now much more famous than he ever was in his lifetime. And what's made him famous was an event that took place 5,000 miles away, the murder of an African-American man outside a convenience store in Minneapolis.
Edward Colston himself never lived to see his reputation celebrated or condemned. And whilst his statue would be erected in Bristol, the city of his birth, it was London where Colston spent most of his working life.
We know that in his 12 years, Colston's involvement in the Royal Africa Company, that more than 80,000 Africans are transported into slavery by the company that he is working for, that he's a shareholder for, that he's partly for 2 years deputy governor of. And we know that around 19,000 of them died. And this statue was silent about them. They were invisible in this whole story. And that really, for me, was the problem with the statue. Not just that it told half-truths about a man, it said what he did with the money and it didn't mention where the money came from. It was absolutely silent about the people who died and suffered and who were whipped and beaten and mutilated and punished in order to create this fortune.
Edward Colston gave away much of his wealth before his death in 1721. But that wasn't the end of the story. Over 100 years later, a 19th century cult had emerged among Bristol's elite who wanted to celebrate Colston's philanthropy.
What the statue of Edward Colston perfectly demonstrates is the fact that statues don't tell history. They're not designed to tell history, because the real history it tells is not of Edward Colston's life in the 17th century, but of Bristol in the late 19th century and the merchant elite who wanted to create a civic saint out of a slave trader to benefit their position and their dominance over the city. The statue was erected by men who knew that Colston was a slave trader. They just didn't care, because they could never imagine a moment in the future in which anyone would care about the tens of thousands of Africans that Colston was complicit in enslaving and killing. They couldn't imagine a time like the 21st century where the lives of those Africans would matter.
I don't think things will ever go back. The history is finally coming to the surface. And I think when things stop being secretive, then change comes about.
While 17th century slave traders such as Edward Colston channeled profits back to England, a new generation of Englishmen crossed the Atlantic to build wealth overseas, and one individual would leave a devastating legacy. Elias Ball was just 22 years old when he left his family in Devon for the newly formed English colony of Carolina. One of 13 original colonies founded in North America, the English established a settlement on a peninsula by the Ashley and Cooper Rivers, known as Charleston today.
The English were already involved in the transatlantic slave trade. This wasn't anything new, and they were looking for their opportunity to make their way into colonizing the Western Atlantic world. So Virginia, Barbados, and ultimately in South Carolina become very important.
North of Charleston, descendant and award-winning writer Edward Ball is recreating the journey made by his English ancestor, Elias Ball, when he started his new life in America.
The crop in South Carolina was rice, not cotton.
All of these grasses were rice fields at one time. There would be hundreds of people that up to their thighs in mud.
It was back-breaking work, and it was never-ending.
This was the factory that produced the wealth of the Southern American states.
There's a growing awareness of what the slave trade bequeathed to the descendants of people who were involved, and what it meant to the creation of wealth in Britain, what it meant to the creation of wealth in America.
The year 1698 marked the start of the Ball dynasty in South Carolina, when Elias Ball inherited a single plantation, Cumming Tea, from his father's half-brother.
We're at the main house of Cumming Tea Plantation. Elias Ball built this house about 1740 and lived here until his death, surrounded by his 100 enslaved workers. And many generations of the Balls lived here for the next 175 years. It was the hub of the hive. And now it's quiet, as it should be.
We have to understand our history, warts and all. But you have to fess up to that, own up to it, get into the detail of the hundreds of years in which it was constructed and why it was constructed.
Edward decided to study the records kept by successive generations of the Ball family, found today at the South Carolina Historical Society.
This book is pigskin-bound ledger. It chronicles buying and selling of people. Jenny, born and bought Hampshire. Who was born and who died? Paul, Blackjack, Will, Harry. Who ran away when they were recaptured?
Edward discovered that over the course of nearly 200 years, his family had owned more than 20 rice plantations and enslaved over 4,000 African Americans. And one name in particular would allow Edward to connect his English past with his American present.
Here it is. This is 1756 in July. I bought 4 boys and 2 girls. Sancho, 9 years old. Peter, ditto. Brutus, 7. Harriet, 6. Belinda, 10. Priscilla, 10. Like many, many descendants of slaveholders, I looked the other way. Because to look at the legacy of slavery in its face, this bloody heirloom, is a very hard assignment for anyone.
Facing up to his family history, Edward tracked down descendants of those enslaved on his family's estates. At the entrance to Charleston Harbor, he's meeting Tomalin Martin Polite, the 7th-generation descendant of 10-year-old Priscilla.
As far as I know, we are the only family that has an unbroken paper trail to name the actual person who came from Sierra Leone to America as a slave.
People kidnapped from the so-called Rice Coast of West Africa weren't just stolen for the capacity of their bodies, but also for their skills and knowledge.
Because of the similar terrain of South Carolina to Sierra Leone, it was perfect for rice growing, and Sierra Leoneans had developed a very sought-after talent that South Carolinians wanted and needed to help cultivate their rice plantations.
The shipment of black Africans, the use of them as chattel and as goods, the wealth that was amassed across the world, is in the modern era unparalleled in its destructive force.
Like Tomalin's ancestor Priscilla, 40% of all enslaved Africans brought to the United States came through Charleston Harbor.
We are standing at Sullivan's Island, which is where the ship named the Hare brought Priscilla along with the rest of the captives. There were 110, 85 survived. They were taken to the pest houses to be inspected as if merchandise. And then the slaves were taken to be sold to Elias Ball, the Cumming Tea Plantation. Priscilla, she stayed there for 55 years, bore 10 children, and she died at the age of 65 on Cumming Tea Plantation.
How does that make you feel?
It makes me sad. It makes me proud, though. It's a very humbling experience as well. When you think of the issues that I face or that we face today, it makes it seem so minute compared to what she faced.
To look honestly at the slave past is like glancing into a wound in order to try to release the poisons which have been trapped, with the hope, the dim hope, that the wound might heal properly.
Finally, I think large sections of white society is beginning to ask themselves questions, whereas perhaps they didn't before. For some reason, white America is suddenly listening.
From the very start of the Atlantic slave trade, Africans had fought against slavery, rebelling and resisting on slave ships and on the plantations. But in the late 18th century, another group began to emerge, the abolitionists. And the writing of one campaigner, who had a huge impact in America, also brought his message to Britain.
This book made Frederick Douglass arguably the most famous black person in the world, an extraordinarily dangerous position to be in, because Frederick Douglass was an escaped slave.
The world of slavery was one of constant conflict and rebellion. But in the late 18th century, a political movement emerged committed to abolition. And one of the most powerful tools in its arsenal was the publication of first-hand accounts by people who had themselves been enslaved.
On a signal given, the buyers rush at once into the yard where the slaves are confined and make a choice of that parcel they like. In this manner, without scruple, are relations and friends separated. Most of them never to see each other again.
Accounts such as these helped turn British public opinion before slavery was abolished in 1833. But in America, the road towards abolition was infinitely longer and more complex. And one African-American abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, would do more than most to turn the tide of history.
Frederick Douglass was met with all forms of segregation and racism, and yet managed to rise above that. How so? By focusing on liberating his brothers and sisters.
Born into slavery in Maryland around 1818, Frederick Douglass was separated from his mother as a young child.
There are accounts where people talk about children being ripped out of people's hands and sold away at 2 months old. There's the physical abuse, but then there's the mental abuse.
Frederick Douglass was separated from his mother at a very young age, and then he was made to live with his grandmother, and again another separation.
Douglass was moved from one plantation to the next and leased to several farmers, including Edward Covey, a particularly brutal slave breaker. Then in 1838, when only 20 years old, Douglass escaped and headed to the free states of the North. Once settled in Massachusetts, Douglass became an agent for abolitionist societies, meeting key figures who encouraged him to share his story. And in 1845, he published an autobiography in which he took the bold move to name his legal owner.
The publication of his autobiography is a political act. He's ready to lose what he acquired for the sake of telling that story and sharing that story.
The book was an instant success, but it catapulted Frederick Douglass to a dangerous level of fame for someone who was still the legal property of another. Without delay, in the August of 1845, Douglass bid farewell to his wife and 4 children and boarded a ship bound for Britain. Historian David Olusoga has travelled to Tyneside, where he grew up, to tell the story of a British family with whom Frederick Douglass enjoyed an enduring transatlantic friendship.
This book made Frederick Douglass arguably the most famous black person in the world. But to be famous, to be someone whose image was known to thousands of people, that was an extraordinarily dangerous position for Douglass to be in, because in the 1840s he was still an escaped slave. He was still legally the property of the slave owner Thomas Olds. And so Douglass did what many African Americans did in that time, which was he came to Britain.
By the time Frederick Douglass arrived in Britain in 1845, slavery had already been abolished. But that wasn't the end of the British anti-slavery movement.
There was a whole network of abolitionists who are now anti-slavery campaigners, who saw it as the mission of Victorian Britain to fight against slavery everywhere in the world, and particularly in the United States. And Douglass was able to tap into that network. Every city he went to, he would be welcomed, and he would lodge at the houses of anti-slavery activists. And he traveled around Britain in the time he was here, almost 2 years, and spoke hundreds of times. And one of the places that he came was to Newcastle.
One prominent group of anti-slavery activists were the Quakers, the first religious group on either side of the Atlantic to come out against slavery.
This house was home to a family called the Richardsons. It was Ellen, her sister Anna, and her husband Henry. They were radical Quakers. They'd been involved in the campaigns to end slavery in the British Empire, and in the 1840s, it was in this house that Frederick Douglass stayed while he was in Newcastle. Anna and Ellen began the process through meetings and writing letters of purchasing the freedom, purchasing the manumission papers for Frederick Douglass.
However, the transaction arranged to purchase Douglass's freedom was, for some, deeply problematic. Douglass and the Richardsons were immediately criticized.
Douglass's freedom is to be purchased through a legal contract of sale, and the argument was made that to accept a transaction is to accept that Douglas was chattel, that he was something that could be bought and sold. One of the people who makes this argument is the abolitionist Henry Clark Wright, and he wrote a letter to Frederick Douglass, and that letter, along with Frederick Douglass's response to it, was published in this newspaper, The Liberator, the great American abolitionist newspaper. This is from January 1847. Dear Frederick, that certificate for your freedom, that bill of sale for your body and your soul from that villain, Thomas Auld, who dared to claim you as chattel and set a price on you, I wish you would not touch it. Douglas responds by stating some pretty stark and painful facts. He says, I am in England, my family are in the United States. My sphere of usefulness, where he can be most effective in fighting slavery, is in the United States. But I am legally the property of Thomas Auld, and if I go to the United States, Thomas Auld, aided by the American government, can seize, bind, and fetter me, and drag me from my family, and feed his cruel revenge upon me, and doom me to unending slavery. And Douglas rejects this idea that by purchasing his freedom from Thomas Auld, that he is accepting the idea of property in men. He says that it is almost like giving money to an armed robber. You're not accepting the morality or the legality of being mugged or being robbed at gunpoint when you hand your money over.
Douglas returned to the United States in 1847, but he never forgot his time in Britain or his friends in Newcastle.
In this letter, Douglas describes his feelings to Anna and to Britain. He says, all England is dear to me, and though long in her borders and absent from home and anxious to be at home, I left with the heaviest of heart that words cannot express. But, he says, I now have my manumission papers. These are the papers that prove that legally he is no longer enslaved. There is nothing that will sting the Americans more than the fact that I landed on your shores a slave and came back a free man.
Upon his return to America, he was reunited with his family in upstate New York, where he began publishing his first abolitionist newspaper and where he continued the American fight for the abolition of slavery.
Whereas in England, the horrors and torture in the Caribbean were kept out of sight of the British public, America was born in slavery. I think that many people got addicted to that power. The southern states in particular, that's why they went to war, right?
The South wasn't just a society that had slaves. It was a slave society. And what that meant was every part of Southern society is built around an enslaved labor system.
The northern and southern states had disagreed for decades on the powers of federal government and Western expansion. And with the election of President Abraham Lincoln in 1860, tension soon came to a head.
Lincoln runs on a platform to stop the spread of slavery into the new states out west. The southern states say if we can't expand, then maybe slavery will die.
Within months of President Lincoln's election victory, 7 southern states broke away from the Union. And when the incoming Lincoln administration refused to recognize their legitimacy, Confederate forces opened fire.
The Civil War is really a cauldron where a variety of issues, political issues, notions of citizenship, all come together. But you've got to understand that African Americans have always demanded citizenship.
And Frederick Douglass was one such campaigner. Kenneth B. Morris Jr. is the 3 times great-grandson of Frederick Douglass. Kenneth was inspired to continue his ancestors' legacy when he read an article in National Geographic magazine.
I really spent most of my life taking this lineage for granted, and it wasn't until I read that National Geographic magazine article with the headline, 21st Century Slaves, that I started to feel connected to this lineage.
Today, Kenneth runs a charity seeking to end human trafficking and modern-day slavery. But in the 19th century, his ancestor played a key role in the abolitionist movement. Kenneth has traveled to New York to meet Professor Maurice Wallace and learn more about the unique role Frederick Douglass played in the American Civil War.
What do you think Frederick Douglass's ambitions were during the war?
So I think he understood that the abolition of slavery once and for all depended upon Union victory. And he wanted nothing more than for Lincoln to get behind that cause. And there were at least a couple of meetings with Lincoln. And Douglass was a little surprised at just how humane Lincoln was. But I also think that Lincoln was a little surprised at just how shrewd Douglass was.
In the first year of the Civil War, the services of African-American soldiers were denied by the federal government.
It really wasn't until the Union Army was suffering many losses. Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation in late 1862, beginning in 1863, that they suddenly begin to say, we'll take black soldiers. But there was a great deal of hesitancy.
For Douglass, this was the turning point he had been waiting for.
Why do you think my great ancestor was so adamant about recruiting black soldiers to the cause?
He imagined that black soldiers would fight with even greater convictions than their white peers for their own people's liberty, their own liberty in many cases. I think, too, that he was also persuaded that black men who enlisted in the war could demonstrate black people's deservedness of American citizenship.
And Douglass himself became a recruiter for the Massachusetts 54th.
I see some images, Frederick Douglass's sons, am I correct, as enlistees in the Civil War.
Yeah, Douglass was so committed to the cause that his sons were his first recruits. This is Charles is my great-great-grandfather, and then this would be my great-great-great-uncle Lewis. Charles in particular was the first black man in New York to enlist. Charles became ill when they were training, and he never fought with the Massachusetts 54th, but Lewis fought in the Battle of Fort Wagner and Morris Island. Cause of abolition was so important to these two men that they would be willing to die and give up their freedom. I'm really proud of that because I wonder, if I would have had that same commitment, that they had.
Douglass's sons were born free, but many of the 200,000 African Americans who fought on the side of the Union had themselves been enslaved. And 8 months after Union victory in 1865, slavery was finally abolished. 4 million African Americans began their lives as free people, yet the terrible legacy of slavery, racism, and white supremacy would continue to divide America for generations to come.
Frederick Douglass said, without struggle, there is no progress. And this country is undergoing a mighty struggle right now. And I think that he would still be out there agitating, speaking truth to power, and he would expect that his descendants continue that fight, continue that struggle.
Nearly 60 years before the murder of George Floyd shook the world, another struggle sent shockwaves through Britain and America. The fight for civil rights would change the course of world history.
In America, and certainly in the American South, the past is never really past. History is not dead. It's alive, and it's very much alive in the lives of black Americans today.
For Americans, in the North and South, the abolition of slavery heralded the start of a new era. African Americans served in government positions and became members of Congress.
僕らそれほどな街らおけま50キロ中にらそうどこかかレトストなかってしたから時々話したわしかにひかini masih buka bisa malemita watashi ga nato imasi capisha osiwa dikito.
But in 1877, a decade of progress came to an abrupt end when the last remaining federal troops were withdrawn from the South.
Everything that we fought for was rolled back. It was all rolled back.
Segregation, intimidation, and racial violence took hold in America's Deep South.
Ending slavery on the books is one thing, but once that happens, what's next? Barriers were placed in the way, obstacles were placed in the way. And so by the time you have a Rosa Parks, Black people had gained this mentality of no more.
After civil rights campaigner Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, public attention around the globe was drawn to the injustice of segregation.
Rosa Parks was tired of the oppression, the exploitation, being treated in an inhumane way.
The injustice caught the attention of many, including a young Martin Luther King Jr.
Daddy taught that we will triumph. Not over people, but over injustice and over hate.
Let all of us be calm and reasonable. We can integrate the buses Montgomery with no difficulty.
During the Montgomery bus protest is when he started articulating this as nonviolence.
In December 1955, 40,000 African-American passengers boycotted the buses. 13 months later, the US Supreme Court ruled that Montgomery's buses should be desegregated. The Montgomery bus boycott demonstrated that grassroots activism could lead to real and sustained change. And its success rippled across the world.
The legacy of slavery, racism, people are still struggling to fight against the system. I mean, it's huge.
Events in America were closely followed by African Caribbean migrants who arrived in Britain after the Second World War.
Think about the Windrush generation. We were part of the British Empire. So you kind of go, we could go to any of these other countries, but we chose to come to Britain.
My mother was one of the Windrush generation. There was this desperation to fit in, to give your children very British-sounding names.
But the migrants did not receive the warm welcome they had expected.
You know, there were signs on doors saying, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs.
And black communities in London and Nottingham were attacked by white youths. By the 1960s, around 3,000 African Caribbean men, women, and children had settled in Bristol. Among them, the Jamaican-born father of Bristol's current mayor, Marvin Rees.
The hostility towards people with black and brown skin coming into the UK was something that took people by surprise. And they would be abused, they'd be physically attacked. Work would have been tough to find.
Until the 1960s, there were no laws to prevent racial discrimination in Britain, and civil protest emerged once again.
There was an overt policy of not employing black people, Asian people on Bristol's buses. People were being absolutely excluded from economic opportunity.
The point is that whilst we can obtain white labour in this city, we intend to go on engaging white labour rather than coloured labour.
And some white bus conductresses didn't want to work with black male drivers.
It's not very nice for a woman to be out till 12:30 at night with a coloured man, is it? Not a white woman.
Inspired by the success of protests in America, civil rights campaigners in Bristol, led by youth officer Paul Stevenson, organised a campaign to boycott the buses. Just 4 months later, the Bristol Omnibus Company lifted its colour bar.
I think this is going to be welcomed by coloured people all over Bristol and many Bristolians who came in and gave us their sympathy.
Well, the bus boycott, I think, was of profound importance, not just in Bristol, but across the country. And interestingly, the day of success was the same day as I Have a Dream by Martin Luther King, 1963.
3 weeks later, Bristol Omnibus Company had hired its first non-white bus conductor, Ragbir Singh.
People began to get opportunity. But it wasn't just about jobs on the buses, because that led to the first raft of Equalities Act in the UK as well.
In 1965, the Race Relations Act was the first piece of legislation to prohibit racial discrimination in Britain.
And when I look at my journey, being the first African heritage mayor of any British city, I have to trace my own journey back to the fights and the efforts that happened before I was born. And again, Bristol finds itself in this spot. We have the BLM rally, the statue gets pulled down, the world looks to Bristol, and we end up contributing to the shape and of the way the world thinks about race inequality.
Britain's attempts to draw a veil over those 2 centuries as a slave trading and a slave owning power just haven't worked. This history is re-emerging into the 21st century because it was never acknowledged in the 19th and the 20th century.
It was the English who, in their early Caribbean colonies, first fully institutionalized and codified racism.
White supremacy is an English invention that was franchised to several different countries.
For the next 200 years, slavery was to have a huge impact around the globe.
The slave system created the ruins that we're still navigating. This enormous global system changed the world, and it changed us in the process.
And that history has left a bitter legacy that we're still grappling with today.
When you look at George Floyd's death and the worldwide movement which resulted, you realize that there are people today who will make sure that we do not ignore history.
We're told constantly, Black Lives Matter, that's about America, it's got nothing to do with Britain. It's about what we haven't been told, what we don't have the opportunity of learning.
I'm not sure if it's possible to be a black man or woman in the USA, in Britain, in Africa, and not be angry, knowing what we do about our history and knowing what we face in the present.